Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to the Christmas Day truce of World War I. So this is going to be interesting because apparently during World War I, obviously the Brits, the Germans, I think the Russians and Americans, I think so. It was a world war, but on Christmas Day, for some reason, I believe, there was a truce in the sense that both sides stopped fighting temporarily. I think it was for just the day of Christmas. And apparently there was a football game between the Brits and the Germans, like a soccer match. I'm not sure if this is true or not, because it sounds pretty incredible to think that, you know, two nations that are in the middle of an absolutely devastating war would, you know, just for Christmas would stop, lay down their weapons and just play a game of football. But apparently it happened. I want to find out what actually happened. So this video, I'm hoping it's going to really just give us all the facts that actually took place. You know, they're not going to romanticize it. They're just going to tell us how it is, how it went down, because I'm really, really interested in this story. It should be a really fascinating one. So yeah, let's do it.
In 2016, IWM was contacted by the family of one of the soldiers shown in this photograph. We now know that this is Arno Bohm, a German soldier standing alongside British troops from the London Rifle Brigade.
Wow.
They're standing together in the middle of no man's land during the Christmas truce of 1914.
I see.
This photograph captures a moment so unusual in the First World War that many people at the time and to this day believed it to be a myth. In the midst of a brutal, total war, how did this momentary peace come about?
Honestly.
What impact did it have in the course of the First World War? And why did it never happen again?
Great questions.
We were in the front line. We were about 300 yards from the Germans, and we had, I think, on Christmas Eve, we'd been singing carols and this, that and the other, and the Germans had been doing the same.
What a life, you know. This is Christmas Day and they are in the trenches, in the literal trenches, you know, celebrating Christmas. You know, no elaborate Christmas dinner for them. Still probably going to be military rations. It's cold, it's damp.
And we'd been shouting to each other, sometimes rude remarks, more often just joking remarks. Eventually a German said, "Tomorrow you no shoot, we no shoot."
Awesome.
At the start of the war, many believed it would all be over by Christmas. However, by December that year, it was obvious that this was not the case, and thousands of families and soldiers were facing a Christmas of separation, grief and hardship.
Terrible.
So for those soldiers who are in the trenches over winter 1914, the conditions would have got gradually worse and worse.
Of course.
You've got a lot of rain, a lot of frost, and the general living conditions would have been terrible.
Imagine the rate of infection as well. You know, these are dirty, damp. Bacteria must be rife. People probably haven't bathed or showered in maybe weeks. Like, just a different time, honestly, a different time.
But the British troops were not alone. In the trenches opposite theirs, sometimes only 30 yards away across the strip of no man's land, were German soldiers in the exact same situation.
There was lots of opportunity for each side to communicate with the other. And this was a regular thing which happened right from the start of trench warfare. But communication would often be in the form of soldiers from one side shouting over insults to those in the other trenches. But what was interesting at Christmas is that both sides actually started to communicate in more friendly terms.
Just war, honestly, like, you know, these are just people. You know, why have they got to be sent there to kill each other? I would love it if the people who lead these armies, like the politicians, why don't you go to war? If you want a war so bad, why don't you go, and whoever wins between you and the other guy wins the war? You know, why do thousands of young men and women, or men in this case, why do they have to lay down their lives, honestly?
really began with the Germans singing Christmas carols and setting up Christmas trees on top of their parapets. And so they came to very much empathise with one another.
I remember very well Christmas. I remember the Christmas day when the German and the French soldiers left their trenches, went to the barbed wire between them with champagne and cigarettes in their hands.
Wow.
And had feelings of fraternization and shouted they wanted to finish the war. And that lasted only 2 days, 1.5 really. And then strict order came that no fraternization was allowed and we had to stay back in our trenches.
You know what I mean? Why can't they fraternize? I hate war. I hate it.
The Christmas truce varied in different parts of the front line. Ceasefires were hastily arranged, sometimes to enable the collection and burial of bodies or to allow the trenches to be repaired. In other cases, the soldiers simply enjoyed fraternising with the other side.
And we shared fags, goodies with the Germans.
If anyone, if you don't know, like fag is British slang for cigarettes, just in case you didn't know.
And then from somewhere, somehow, this football appeared.
Was it a proper football?
It was a proper football. But we didn't form a team. It wasn't a team game in any sense of the word. You know, it was a kick-about. Everybody was having a go. It came from their side. It wasn't from our side where the ball came.
How many people were taking part, do you think?
Well, I should think there'd be at least a
Wow.
couple of hundred.
Couple of hundred. One
yes,
football.
I was pretty good then, 19.
19. He was a
But
kid.
while some parts of the front line were playing football and swapping stories, others were confused by what they heard or felt no inclination to socialise with those they had so recently been fighting.
After a few moments, there were lighted objects raised above the German parapet. The Germans were shouting over to our trench. There's no doubt about that at all. And before we could take any action or do anything, we were ordered to open rapid fire.
Really?
Which we did.
Oh,
The Germans
no.
did not reply to our rapid fire. They simply carried on with their celebrations and were having a very fine time indeed. They certainly were not going to do it anymore. They thought that we were idiots, I suppose. We were. Well, not us, but the...
I feel so bad because the Brits probably didn't want to fire their weapons, but you've got to follow chain of command, haven't you?
Command, is it?
The way that trench warfare was organised in the First World War, each sector was very distinctive, and so you wouldn't necessarily know what was happening in the sector next door to you. And you do get stories of one area of the front where they're experiencing a truce, but then suddenly they get fired on by the troops in the next sector who don't realise what's happening.
For those soldiers not
Miscommunication.
involved, the truce must have seemed unbelievable, and even more so for those back home. For months, the media and government propaganda had shaped a perception of German soldiers as bloodthirsty enemies, baby-eaters, devils, ruthless killers. But news of the remarkable Christmas truce soon spread abroad. By the end of December, letters and photos arrived home, and newspapers began to publish accounts of the truce.
My father was delighted to have a letter giving such a description of events, and he sent them up to the Daily Telegraph. I got into a frightful rocket. That showed up that it must have been me who wrote it, and Mossy got hold of me, gave me an awful dressing down for daring to write to the press. But of course I didn't. My old man wrote to the press.
These photographs were taken on personal cameras that some soldiers had taken with them into the trenches.
Wow, personal cameras. I didn't realise they had personal cameras in 1914. These things must have been huge. How did they transport them? And how did they keep them from getting destroyed?
Photography in the trenches was discouraged for obvious reasons, but during the Christmas truce of 1914, soldiers on both sides of the trenches could not resist the opportunity to document such a unique event.
At the beginning of January 1915, the newspapers suddenly start printing these letters. And to begin with, there was a certain amount of disbelief. But then over time, suddenly photographs started to appear as well. And by that time, the evidence was clear that this did
Irrefutable
happen, wasn't
evidence,
it?
yeah.
And the media at the time absolutely loved it. There were lots of discussions in the newspapers about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. And, you know, in a way, it's a wonderful snapshot of Christmas 1914 when attitudes were still slightly naive because the war had only really just begun. You find that in 1915 and onwards, the war becomes almost a much more serious endeavour.
Ah, okay. So at this point, the war had just begun. So animosity between all of the nations involved wasn't probably at its peak. Like that hatred for the enemy wasn't at its all-time high. I see now. That's a good bit of context that I didn't know.
The Christmas truce would come to be remembered as something of a blip in the regular conduct of the war. It conflicted with the patriotic aggression required by both sides. It also served to highlight the great contrast between war and religion. How can you fight a war of aggression while also celebrating Christmas, the traditional time for peace and goodwill?
Good question.
For those reasons, the Christmas truce was increasingly seen as unimportant and awkward to fit into the standard narrative of the First World War.
You never get anything like the Christmas truce happening again. And over time, not only is it seen as an anomaly, but almost as a myth. And it gets to the point where people are actually doubting whether it happened in the first place.
I totally get that. You know, when you think of World War One, you think of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people dying. You don't really think of, you know, Germans and Brits, you know, laying down their weapons and playing a game of football. Honestly, when I first heard this, I thought it was fake. I thought it was some kind of propaganda, but it's an unbelievable story.
Which continues, you know, right up to this day. So there's still a lot of confusion about whether there was a football match played and things like this.
We didn't cross to France until March of 1915. But although it would be arrogant to say that the thing didn't actually take place, I very much doubt whether anything of the nature or magnitude that has been claimed for it took place at all. Now, the purpose of that barbed wire in the trenches was to keep each side in its own place.
Like
Therefore, why would anybody try to break that? And if anybody tried, what were the NCOs doing? What were the officers doing? I think the whole thing borders on the fairy tale and may be classed with the Russians with snow on their boots and the angels of Mons.
We know by looking at German...
Isn't it crazy to think that person, Harold Lewis, you know, he's probably dead by now, isn't he? If he fought in World War One, he's either dead or he's in his hundreds. It's incredible. It's incredible.
Newspapers, that Christmas truce was covered there in a very similar way to how it was in Britain. In the 1920s and the 1930s, you see definite examples of how the Christmas truce changes in its depiction, because there was a much greater emphasis then on the German soldier as a hero fighting a noble war, whereas the Christmas truce conflicts with that to a degree. So in Germany in particular, the Christmas truce goes out of favour definitely in the 20s and 30s, whereas in Britain it continues to be the popular celebrated story.
The legend lives on over here. Got you. It's interesting to see the distinction in how the Germans and the Brits, you know, took this story
as part of the First World War.
The letters and photographs that reached home in Britain confirmed that this remarkable event had indeed taken place, but it was one that was not to be repeated.
The Christmas truce was unique, and nothing like it happened again to that scale. And the reasons for this are varied. Immediately after the truce, the high command of both sides stepped in to make sure that fraternisation and ceasefires like this would not happen in the same way. But also, in the long term, the real...
I totally get why they did that, because obviously it's much harder to kill someone that you've got something of a relationship with. I get it. I totally do. But I mean, in a wider context, like, why are you at war? You know, can't this be settled in some other, you know, less violent way? Anyway.
The reason that truces like this didn't happen is that the war changed in the way in which it was being fought. As the war progressed, there's a more centralised method of command. Those in the front line would have been forced into constant aggression. You would have had artillery and trench mortar units constantly going, and also, of course, as the war progressed,
this
it took a
footage
far
is
nastier
incredible.
turn. So you get things like gas warfare introduced, an increasing number of civilian casualties. You also get incidents like the sinking of the Lusitania. The temptation, I suppose, to empathise with the enemy and the desire to fraternise with them changed dramatically from 1915 onwards.
Yeah, I can understand that and why that happened. I get it.
It can be argued that the Christmas truce made little difference to the course of the First World War, but it would be remembered as a crucial moment in history.
This footage is incredible. All these men, every single one that we can see here is likely dead. All of them.
The truce has featured in films, television programmes, inspired songs, and even featured in adverts. It's become part of the symbolism used when discussing the First World War, as synonymous with that conflict as poppies, mud, and war poets. This unique event has become legendary, in part because the idea of peace at Christmas in such an unlikely place is an irresistible story. But its enduring legacy is also due to these incredible photographs and the interviews from those who were there, documenting an event that to so many still seems wholly unbelievable.
Fantastic video. Fantastic. Honestly, I got chills watching that quite a few times. Just a real display of humanity, you know, in the midst of huge violence. Just to be able to, you know, look at the enemy and just for one day, you know, they're not your enemy. Just that one day, that one brief moment in time, you can just forget about the international conflict that's going on and just, you know, see them as other human beings, you know, and in a wider sense, it just, like I mentioned in the video, like in my reaction, just why do we have wars? It's just so, I just think they're just, why do we have them? Why do we have to kill each other in such huge numbers? You know, over what? Land? Over natural resources? It's just like, there's more than enough to go around, really. Like, I genuinely believe that there is more than enough to go around. We don't need to be, you know, engaging in these huge conflicts where often it's the young who die. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think about that. Maybe it's a bit too philosophical for this video, but yeah, I just, watching all those troops, you know, living in those cold, you know, wet, probably, you know, unhygienic trenches, you know, my heart really went out to them. You know, they didn't want to be there. They were sent there. Crazy video. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.